everybody, and I would like to open with a quick explanation. We're going to be shifting time periods because of several factors that played a part in me starting the wrong portion of the history continuum that you're studying for freshman history. So we're now going to kind of fast forward to about 1500, and we're going to try to catch you up a little bit to where you would be, about third week of 1500. So let me tell you that it is largely my fault. I should have paid attention to the class number as it was listed on the Canvas interface. So that is my fault, and I apologize for that. That being said, there are several things that are in store for you this week and next week that will kind of make up for it a little bit. This week we will have a test that is more aligned with bridging that gap between what you have been observing and what you have been reading about and what we're going to be studying. So that is 1500, 1600, and into the 1700s. And we're also going to be dropping the Epic of Gilgamesh and Dante's Inferno in favor of another book. And I'll be doing that on the revised syllabus. You'll see that in the revised syllabus as well. So what does this mean for you? Well, it means that you're going to have more opportunities to do a little bit of writing here and there in preparation for the new book. So instead of two books, we're only going to have one, but we're going to have some build up to that big one book so that you understand how to structure things historically, understand how to source your quotes, how to cite properly, and that sort of thing. So it's kind of a training wheels kind of thing. The good part of that means that it is much more lenient when we grade. That means there's going to be more points spread out over more assignments, so you won't have a big clumping assignment right off the bat. All right, that being said, so here is where we're at. We're at a kind of an accidental time machine. Well, we started off in the classic ancient world, and that's where we kind of are right now. We're going to go ahead and skip over the medieval and Renaissance period and jump right into what historians call the modern era. And that's where we are now. So basically 1500 up to just shy of 1700. That's what we're covering this week. So where do we go from here? Well, we're going to look at three things, three factors, three main arcs. The first is the legacy of the medieval and Renaissance world. This idea of where is wealth concentrated, what societies are the most successful, what leads to inquiry about the natural world, and also some other more close to home factors as to why the world changes around 1500, and that is largely due to a trade imbalance. There are a lot of other factors, but for our purposes, we're going to focus on the trade imbalance because, well, economics is always personal. The second step that we're going to do is we're going to set the stage for change. Part of the change comes from exploration of the world, mostly European exploration. Why European? Well, it's not because Europeans are better at something. It's not because Europeans are just better human beings or more evolved or whatever, any of these racist, weird, old nonsense. The reality is Europeans were a little bit more desperate. They were a little bit more adaptive to change. They had more motivation to change. And to be honest, Europeans keep cropping up throughout world history from about 1500 onward, especially when we get into the 1800s, 1900s, and definitely in the 20th century. So that means that the world is expanding. So the interconnectedness of peoples through person-to-person interaction, government-to-government interaction, as well as trade interaction, because again, trade is personal, economics are personal. So that begins to interweave societies that had previously been separated by vast differences and vast cultural differences and vast linguistic differences. And that leads us to step three. These new encounters and their effects upon the future, upon the 1700s, 1800s, and beyond. So let's condense back to that step one and look at the legacy of the medieval and Renaissance world. Now, as we've kind of intimated at the beginning, the first 3 weeks of 1500, there are some societies that are very, very successful, including, but not limited to, China and India, and to a lesser degree, the Middle East. These three societies, or these three regions, sprout societies that become incredibly wealthy, incredibly well connected. China, for example, China's history has a long standing uh, succession of dynasties that are large, they're powerful, they're extremely affluent. In fact, China begins and remains to this day as the most populous region on the planet. Why is that? Well, honestly, because of conditions that are present in China. Multiple rivers, very beneficial climate for growing foods, a very efficient government that is able to distribute food, allow the movement of people, allow the movement of trade, and also a very strong central government that is able to expand power and consolidate that. This is true from about 200-ish BC to the present. China is a very powerful society. It has this kind of momentum of populace, of wealth, of resources that allow it to really take prominence on the world stage for most of human history. There's a few centuries in which China begins to be eclipsed. There is just shy of 100 years that China is held in a subservient position. But as we see in the late 20th century and early 21st century, China begins to resurge. Same thing is true with India. India is one of many sources of scholarship, particularly in mathematics, medicine, and astronomy. India has a long-standing um, role within a world trade network, particularly in Eurasia, of being kind of a stop-off point for trade, but also being a source of luxuries, things like teas and spices. So it too is very wealthy and very powerful. Unlike China, it doesn't have a long history of centralized governments that are extremely strong. That'll pick up as we move through the modern period, but in reality, India has a kind of melange of different cultures, of different ideas, of different procedures for addressing social ills. In many ways, it's much like the classic Greek period, where you have these city-states that share linguistics, that share mythology, that share some cultural touchstones, but are very, very different and often rivals to each other. Same is true in India. India has a lot of these kingdoms, these principalities, sometimes empires emerge that have a shared language, that they have a shared cultural touchstones, or they have shared religious ideas, but they're often rivals to each other. And then finally, the Middle East. The Middle East, at this point in the early modern period, is extremely powerful. The Ottoman Empire, and to a lesser degree in what is now modern-day Iran, the Safavid Empire, are very wealthy. They're benefiting from being kind of a nexus of trade and cultural exchange. They are the medium, if you will, the kind of warehouse for trade going into Europe, so all the luxury goods going into Europe, and all the money coming out of Europe. So they have a lot of money invested. Not as wealthy as, say, India, not as wealthy as, say, China, not nearly as powerful as either of those two militarily, but definitely very, very strong. And as such, they are often kind of the brokers between cultures. The Middle Eastern empires, the Ottoman Empire and the Safavids, they often are kind of the ones who translate medical texts, for example, or who comment upon the use of numerals of what are later called Arabic numerals, but they're actually originate in India into Europe versus saying using the Roman numerals, which are very awkward to work with, or treatises on philosophy. The Middle Eastern scholars really become guardians of Roman and Greek learning in a way that the Europeans haven't until we get to the modern period. It's not until about the end of the Renaissance that Europeans are reintroduced to the teachings of Plato and Socrates and some of the other classical philosophers. They had awareness of these works, but thought they had been lost to time. So the Europeans were kind of like all low man on the totem pole, as it were. Europeans, by comparison, after the collapse of the Roman Empire in the 5th century AD, are largely fractured. They have smaller competing societies. They have a legacy of warfare. They have a legacy of lost technology. Things like concrete and physics and construction techniques are lost to the European scholars of the time. So you get much more basic forms of construction until, of course, the Renaissance. The Renaissance is, again, that rediscovery of the ancient world. So not just philosophy, not just science and mathematics, but also understanding of the human body, understanding of how the natural world works. And we start to see that change happening in the late 1400s and into the 1500s. The biggest takeaway, however, for our purposes is that by comparison, Europe has very, very few luxuries that are grown locally, at least not ones that are worthy of trade. Now, Roman glass and Roman wines were highly prized, but again, much like that lost technology of construction, the lost technology of making glass in the Roman style was lost for most of the medieval period and not rediscovered until the Renaissance. So Europeans have a long-standing trade imbalance. This means that they're paying cash instead of bartering for luxuries, things like spices and silks and dyes and things like that. So there's a lot of money flowing out of Europe, keeping Europe relatively poor. That's not to say the Europeans can't be rich. They absolutely were. There were some who were very rich. But in general, as a whole, Europe, especially Western Europe, is relatively poor. So what is that legacy? Well, that legacy, see, we have China that is able to send trade from, for instance, from Wuhan or from Beijing or other major cities and send it westward. A lot of those trades wind up eventually coming to Italy. Italy becomes kind of the intermediary for Europe, the kind of salesman, if you will, for Europe. So China begins a lot of that trade. It proceeds to India. India adds to that trade, subtracts a little bit from that trade, intermixes their products as well. It moves on to the Middle East. Again, there's more products that are added, more luxuries that are added, things like incense, like frankincense and myrrh. There are some other luxuries that are added in the Middle East, like dyes and particularly pigments, the purple pigment that comes from the Middle Eastern, from some of the Middle Eastern plants and crustaceans that are ground up to make that vibrant purple, like indigo, for example. And those are then added and moved further westward. When they reach Europe, of course, they go for a very high price because they've gone through so many intermediaries. So a relatively comparatively inexpensive product in China, by the time it gets to Europe, is extremely expensive. For example, rice in China is a staple of most Chinese food, in fact, most Asian food. It's also relatively common in India, so it goes relatively cheaply. This allows the fostering of large populations. So that's one of the reasons why China and to a lesser degree India have large populations. By the time it gets to Europe, however, rice is an extremely expensive luxury. Why? Well, there's no real place to grow rice, no real good environment to grow rice in Europe. And so they can't just grow their own rice, so they have to import it all. Well, it takes these steps. It goes from, let's say, China to India to Persia to the Middle East. By the time it gets to Turkey, it's extremely expensive because everybody's added their little bit onto it. And so by the time it gets to Italy, it's even more expensive. From Italy, it goes into France or England or Germany or something like that. And it's an extreme delicacy. It's extremely rare. So what does that mean? Well, most of these trade routes do more than just bring goods. Trade is the reason for existing for these networks, but it's not the only thing that is produced along these trade routes. One of the things that emerges is this greater understanding of the world. So maps and stories of lands further afield than most people have been. It is these stories that prompt Marco Polo's father and his uncle, and eventually Marco Polo himself, to explore eastward, to see these lands of India and China and hear the stories firsthand from these foreign lands, to take back tales of their own. Now, some of these tales and some of these maps are extremely exaggerated because there isn't really a scientific way to approach understanding the world, so a lot of distance is subjective. So that's why sometimes the maps look really kind of funky. They look a little bloated, or they propose land masses that are not really there, or they elide land masses that really are there. But it does produce a better understanding of the world, especially for Europeans. Along with maps and along with cartography comes an expansion of mathematics, especially the use of those Arabic numerals that I've mentioned before. I want you to think about the number 1, number 2, number 3, as you write it. Number 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Those are all single digits. They all take place in one little area. They're also kind of like stand-ins for concepts of a larger amount, right? If you think about the number 9, it's just a loop with a line, right? So it's just a symbol, but it also stands in for 9, say, pears, or 9 guns, or 9 birds, or something like that. So it stands for an amount. It's also more efficient than the Roman method of numerals. The Roman numeral 1 and Roman numeral 2 respectively double in size. Roman number 3 has increased threefold by the time you moved up that chain. So it becomes extremely difficult to do mathematics easily with Roman numerals. You can do it, absolutely. It's just a lot more complex than it is with those so-called Arabic numerals. And also concepts such as zero, what were known as sifr in Arabic, comes from the word cipher, which means to be unknown. So it's this kind of placeholder. It doesn't really manifest as a real number the way that, like, say, 1 or 2 or 9 does. Like, for instance, think of 0 birds. You can't. You can't think of 0 birds. You can't think of nothing. So it's a conceptual placeholder that becomes incredibly important in the understanding of the natural world and the understanding of mathematics. Also, ideas such as medicine, particularly surgery and medicines, are transported along these trade routes. This allows for an extension of life in the Mediterranean, for tackling diseases, for approaching curing illnesses. It also, along these routes, comes philosophy. Now, this trade in ideas and learning, is not as one way as, say, the physical trade. For example, dye coming to Europe is going to be expensive. It's going to extract money. That's all the traders care about, is the money that they're getting. However, ideas flow back and forth. They go east and west, north and south. They exchange with each other and they influence each other. Now, trade, just the physical part of it itself, is the kind of medium through which these ideas are exchanged. It's not enough to go, okay, I have some cinnamon, give me some money. Often trade is built upon relationships, and relationships build upon discussions with each other and human interactions. And so that's why sometimes these ideas, concepts like religion, ideas of social dynamics, the what it means to be part of a society, what it means to have power within that society, or even curiosity about other societies or other languages or other religions allow for people to exchange ideas along these trade routes. That's why you see the emergence of Judaism and Christianity in places like India and China, respectively. It's not that the Chinese were really, really enthralled by the story of Jesus. It's because of some of those trade routes allowed for the trade of not just goods, but ideas of Christianity. So you have Jews settling in India, you have Christians settling in China, so that by the time we get to about the 1300s, when the Mongols really burst onto the stage, when the 13th century, I apologize, 13th century, when the Mongols burst on the stage, they're familiar with Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and they're very tolerant of that because they've been exposed to it over the course of several hundred years. So we've got these exchanges. So what finally motivates Western Europeans in particular to explore? Well, if one were an alien looking at the planet in about 1450, you would see that China is the most wealthy, most technologically advanced, most intellectually thorough society of humans, at least in Eurasia. So why didn't the Chinese start exploring? Well, partly is because they already have a very large wealthy empire. They're already generating a lot of trade, so there isn't that impetus to go find new markets or to go find new trade partners. Trade typically comes to China. Now, there was a period of exploration in the 1400s by a explorer by the name of Zhang He. Zhang He was a kind of court appointed, or not legal court, but the imperial court appointed explorer, and he had this massive flotilla of ships. His capital ship, the main flagship, was actually 4 times larger than the ships that Christopher Columbus would use. He had 10,000 men on those ships. So he had a huge, huge navy going along with him. And they went to ports in India and Africa and the Middle East. But when they came back, their findings were not as exciting as the Chinese had hoped. To the Chinese society, everything seemed somewhat inferior, like copies of what China already has. In addition, a lot of the goods that they were bringing back, with the exception of the odd exotic animal here or there, already existed in China. So there really wasn't a motivation to go out and continue that exploration. There's also a little bit of palace intrigue, a little bit of politics involved, in which a rival faction takes over control of the bureaucracy of the government and basically erases Zhang He from Chinese records. Mostly. They're mostly successful, not 100%. So the why of China going out and exploring, well, first, it was different motivation. For China, it wasn't so much to find new markets, it was to project power, to let the world know China is big, China is powerful, China can crush you, and to give you opportunity to give China a tribute. That's basically what it was. Once that was accomplished, there really was no need to continue that. What are you going to do? Do it again? It seems kind of boring. It doesn't have the same kind of motivation. So let's switch over to Europe, though. Now, there's a lot of European countries and a lot of different societies that are of varying interaction with foreign countries. A good example is Italy. Italy becomes extremely wealthy during the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance. In fact, they are the progenitor of the Renaissance. They have massive amounts of wealth. They become bankers to the European nobility. They become bankers to the Pope themselves. They even become popes themselves because bankers control a lot of money. Well, how do they control a lot of that money? Well, they're at the head of a lot of that trade between the Middle East and the rest of Europe. They're the intermediaries. So they're making a very good living in the status quo. Now, there are some explorers, for example, the Marco Polo that I mentioned before, he left Venice and went eastward and stayed in Asia for 24 years before eventually coming back and writing his book. But when he wrote his book, his stories were so fantastic. His stories were so disconnected from what everybody else thought of the world that they were mostly a curiosity. A curiosity that later on would influence other explorers, but really didn't spark the motivation that the Italians needed to become explorers in their own right, to become a nation of explorers. So why didn't Italy become a nation that sends ships hither and yon, discovering new lands, entering into new trade agreements? Much like China, they were already comfortable. They didn't need to go looking for new lands. They didn't need to go looking for new markets and new opportunities. They already had a very good deal worked out with Middle Eastern empires, particularly the Ottoman Empire, to trade. Now, yes, it was a rocky relationship, and sometimes Italians and the Ottomans were at odds with each other, but eventually they kind of overcame those divisions. So let's look at further westward, and let's look at Portugal, about as far west as you can get on continental Europe. Portugal is a relatively weak country. It is surrounded by rivals and by competitors. It has Spain right there on the same continent. To the northeast is France. Directly north is England. So they've got a lot of competition. They also had participated in a series of religious wars in the medieval period called the Reconquista, which ironically ends in 1492. The Reconquista was basically a religious war of Christian Iberians against Muslim Iberians that eventually culminated in the expulsion of Muslims from Iberia, from what is now Spain and Portugal. As a result, Portugal really not a favored nation when it comes to trade, especially with the Middle East. Because, as we noted before, the Middle East is controlled by two massive Muslim empires. So what kind of reception are they going to get? Oh, hey, slaughtered my cousin. Sure, you can have a great deal on the rugs. Or sure, you can have a great deal on this dye. Sure, you can have a great deal on cinnamon. Not really. It's probably not going to work out that way. In fact, the Spanish and the Portuguese found themselves in a similar situation where they couldn't really get favorable terms. So a lot of those luxuries that they'd come to need, a lot of those spices, a lot of those dyes, a lot of those fabrics that they had come to not just desire but absolutely need became incredibly expensive. So there's more motivation to begin to look further and further afield. Now, some of this motivation manifested in personal curiosity. In this case, a Portuguese prince by the name who is nicknamed Henry the Navigator. He was actually a third in line for the throne. He wasn't going to become king, at least not likely to become king. But he was fascinated with stories of other lands and with maps in particular. And he sponsored a lot of the early explorers that began to map the western edge of Africa. And his sponsorship eventually leads to the discovery that the Atlantic Ocean is connected to the Indian Ocean and that there could be a direct line from Europe to India, which means although it's a long way to travel, instead of going through the intermediaries of the Italians and the Ottomans or Safavids, you can go straight to the source to get your luxuries. And that's an incredible draw. You have a combination of curiosity, competitiveness, and a need for luxuries, a need for trade that allows the Portuguese to kind of pioneer this contact with other societies. In fact, the Portuguese are often the first to contact these other Asian societies, India, China, Japan, Indonesia, and others. Now, the Spanish, for their part, also are very curious about the wider world, and they become the sponsors of perhaps the most famous explorer of the world, and that would be Christopher Columbus. And so there we set the stage for this paradigm shift, for this new order for the world. The way that the world used to work is going to become increasingly irrelevant as the centuries move on. Now, Christopher Columbus, it must be stated, is an Italian explorer, but he couldn't find a sponsor in Italy for any of his ideas of creating a new trade network that would head westward instead of eastward. Why would you take a risk on an unknown when the known yields so much wealth? So he couldn't find any sponsors in Italy. He even went to Portugal, drawn by the lure of Henry the Navigator's legacy. Henry the Navigator had died long before, but the legacy of Henry's navigation sponsorship had lived on. And so the Portuguese were at the forefront of exploration. He unfortunately couldn't get an audience, couldn't get any sponsorship with the Portuguese, and so he left for Spain. He begged Spain twice, begged Spain 3 separate times to sponsor his trip. Finally, perhaps partly to get rid of him, perhaps partly because of the need to remain competitive with Portugal, the Spanish crown does grant him some money. They grant him some money, 3 relatively rickety ships, and a crew filled with, well, we're going to say perhaps not the best people, especially because some of his crew was facing lifetime in prison if they stayed home, or the possibility of pardoning if they went with Columbus. So he's got 3 ships full of the maybe down on their luck sailors and felons, essentially, that he is going to explore westward with. Now, when he brings these sailors with him westward, he's not expecting to find a different landmass. He's expecting to find a route that is more direct to China. When he lands in the Western Hemisphere, he sees the physical characteristics of the people in the islands that he lands at and immediately thinks, okay, I'm slightly off course. I've landed in India. And that's where we get this idea of Indians living, right? Now, his discovery of this landmass, he thinks is just an unknown landmass, perhaps off the coast of India, maybe near China. It becomes increasingly evident that his calculations were fairly wrong. In fact, they were off by several thousand miles. However, it is not until much, much later, several decades later, after Columbus's death, that another Italian mathematician, a man named Amerigo Vespucci, finally proves that the Western Hemisphere are 2 separate land masses disconnected from Asia. And in honor of his contribution, in honor of his scientific achievement, the land masses in the Western Hemisphere are named North America and South America. Thus, we have the Americas. So when Columbus arrives in the Western Hemisphere, often in textbooks, often in conversations, it's framed as Columbus discovered the Western Hemisphere. It's a very poor word. Yes, for the Western Europeans, this was a discovery, something that had previously been unknown. And that's where we get the problem. Columbus didn't find an empty land. He found a land filled with people, and a variety of people. They had nations, they had empires, they had tribes, they had kingdoms, they had amazing technological feats, they had marvels of engineering, they had amazingly complex societies. So it's not so much that he discovered the Western Hemisphere for the first time. Nobody had ever seen it before. It's just he made the Europeans aware of it, and in that way, he discovered it. For example, discovering the existence of microbes. Microbes have always been there. We just weren't aware of them, but somebody, quote unquote, discovered them. And that's the context in which we say that Columbus discovers the Western Hemisphere. So what does that mean for the discovered? Well, their portrayal in a lot of the literature, especially coming out of Columbus, is not very charitable. Indeed, Columbus characterizes them as savages because they don't speak Portuguese, Latin, Spanish, or any of the net languages that he knows. On top of it, they seem to have radically different societies. Now, for his part, Columbus is not a very nice guy. In fact, he is eventually removed from his governorship in the Western Hemisphere because of the atrocities that he commits. And I'll have a link to some of that discussion without going into too much detail. Let's just say this is not the hero that you want to celebrate on Columbus Day. Which leads us to the important thing that we have to keep in mind as we move forward. Histories, and because there are multiple histories that happen, they impinge upon each other, they have different sides. Columbus's discovery, for a lack of better term, or let's term it landing. Columbus's landing in the Western Hemisphere changes not just European histories, so the histories of European societies, but also the histories of Africa and the histories of the Western Hemisphere. For example, by landing in the Western Hemisphere, Columbus and other Europeans like him inadvertently bring a devastating array of pathogens with them. This leads to the illness and death of millions of people who lived in the Western Hemisphere, many of whom probably never came into direct contact with Europeans. It's because they didn't have the immunities built up over the eons to these, or the resistances rather, built up over eons to these different diseases, things like smallpox, scarlet fever, even influenza, things like that wiped through. Compounding that is the attitudes of Europeans towards those living in the Western Hemisphere as less than, as somehow subhuman. And we will deal with that legacy for hundreds of years. In fact, we're still dealing with that legacy even now. This idea that somehow the people living in the Western Hemisphere were not worthy of having the Western Hemisphere because they hadn't exploited it, for example, hadn't dredged massive canals or hadn't built massive castles or floated gigantic fleets, chopped down all the forests, dug out all the precious materials. Now, some societies absolutely did. The Aztecs and the Incas, for example, had very wealthy empires, but some did not. So that's kind of like landing in Norway and Sweden and saying that, well, they haven't learned how to build pavilions the way that we did in the Sahara Desert, or that they haven't learned how to conserve water the way that the Berber tribes of North Africa did. See how that kind of like prejudicial treatment changes the way that people interact with other people. The landing of Columbus in the Western Hemisphere also changes life for Africans. There is a vast need for labor now that there's these new lands that are being exploited by the Western Hemisphere. And part of that labor comes from the dehumanization, the incarceration, the transportation of other human beings, most of whom tended to be from Africa. Now, I do have some additional resources to talk about the wide variety of peoples that you find in the Western Hemisphere and reasons why to rethink Columbus Day, the impact of Europeans touching upon indigenous cultures who had been largely isolated, and also to talk about food and how food changes the way that humans interact with the world, and in fact changes the life expectancy of many people around. Part of this is due to what is known as the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange is basically the movement of people, products, pathogens, and creatures from one hemisphere to the other. A good example would be the honeybee. The honeybee is a European insect. It's an invasive species in the Western Hemisphere. However, it is incredibly critical to our food infrastructure. So we need to safeguard honeybees, even though we introduced them. Does that mean that there were no insects over in the Western Hemisphere who were capable of pollinating plants? Absolutely not. It just turned out that the honeybee was the most easily domesticated, easily controlled, and also produced a nice byproduct in the form of honey. Another example would be sugarcane that comes from Eurasia into the Western Hemisphere and becomes an incredibly important industry in the Western Hemisphere. And then the opposite side, tobacco, never been discovered before, found in the Western Hemisphere and becomes a new luxury in Europe. Same thing with cacao or vanilla. Those become incredibly important luxuries. But in addition to luxuries, in addition to people, there are new foods that are introduced. And some of these foods have very profound impact upon the world stage. The potatoes. Humble, unassuming, everyday, don't think twice about it, potatoes. Now, potatoes are a tuber that had been cultivated by Peruvian farmers. And these Peruvian farmers, particularly part of the Inca Empire, had cultivated thousands of different varieties for various reasons. Some to survive certain types of pests, some to thrive in certain types of soil, others to thrive with less light or perhaps more light, arid conditions, wet conditions, you name it. The potato turned out to be a very resilient and amazingly adaptive species for human consumption. On top of it, in general, potatoes have a very dense amount of nutrients associated with them. They also offer some ready carbohydrates. They offer fiber. They have this very beneficial package of things that humans need to survive. Calories, nutrients, fiber, and on top of it, most potatoes can be grown in a relatively marginal soil. If anybody has ever been related to a farmer who grows soybeans or wheat or anything like that, you know that that soil takes a lot of care and maintenance. It takes a lot of nutrients to successfully grow wheat, for example. And wheat's very touchy, particularly in the pre-contemporary period when you don't have chemical fertilizers and chemical pest killers and chemical weed killers or fungicides or things like that. Very, very temperamental. Potatoes, by comparison, grow in some of the most depleted soil conditions there can be. They're often grown in wastelands, and their impact is incredible. They have this profound effect upon the diet of Europeans as well as other societies. Potatoes allow for better nutrition for peasants, particularly in Ireland, Italy, Germany, Russia, where they can become incredibly reliant upon this healthy staple. Potatoes also become the basis for a lot of different food dishes, a lot of different thickening agents. They become the basis of a lot of drinks. And then later on, even later on, they will become the basis for medicinal research. Initial studies of bacteria and the growth of fungi, they use potato slices as a medium. Instead of like today we use agar-agar, which is a kind of a protein matrix. They used to use slices of potato to see how things grow because it had sugars, it had carbohydrates, it had all the building blocks that bacteria needed and found favorable. So potatoes, the humble spud, becomes this worldwide life-sustaining phenomena. The Western Hemisphere, however, especially the exploitation of the Western Hemisphere, whether in the form of conquests, the forming of colonies to extract resources like timber or furs, or to grow food, such as tobacco, sugar cane, or whatever. They're very labor intensive, and there's a call for labor in the Western Hemisphere. However, it's a very arduous trek, it's a very dangerous trek, and it's also a very expensive trek. And so there's this push, this need for some kind of exploitation of people as well. Initially, Europeans thought they could exploit and enslave Native American tribes. Unfortunately, well, perhaps fortunately for some Native American tribes, they turned out to be much easier to escape from bondage. They could basically blend in with the populace. They could run away. They could move. They knew the land, so it was a friendly land. On top of that, many of them were devastated by disease. They would often get sick and they would die relatively quickly. And then finally, there were some debates, some moral debates about how Europeans should treat the native peoples that they find. We'll see a little bit of snippet of that in the Valladolid debate, a source that I'll post in our additional resources. So it turns to initially exploiting the poor of Europe in the form of indentured servitude. If you owed money, one of the ways that you could get out of owing money was to basically take a contract for your service for a number of years to pay off your debts, and then that contract holder would ship you over to the New World where you would work for a number of years. That wasn't quite enough to satisfy. So then new laws began to be passed. So people who were criminals, even minor criminals, children as young as 5 who were accused of stealing bread were convicted of larceny and sent to new worlds to work, where they would basically work the rest of their lives as a criminal indentured servant. And then even when that turned out to be not sufficient enough, the exploitation of existing slave trades in Africa, in particular, began to be more fully exploited. The result was between the 1500s and the 1800s, a movement of tens of millions of Africans from Africa to the Western Hemisphere, often against their will, usually against their will, often separated from families, often forced to work in horrific conditions, and all to enrich their masters, which in turn enriched the colonies back in Europe. I'm sorry, not the colonies, but the home countries back in Europe. Okay, so what all does this matter? Why do we care? Well, um, Columbus isn't the first European to discover the Western Hemisphere. There were discoveries of the Western Hemisphere by Viking sailors, for example, hundreds of years before. Why aren't we talking about, Eric the Red? Why aren't we talking about those Viking explorers? Well, because Columbus initiates a prolonged and permanent contact between Europe and the Western Hemisphere. This profoundly affects the North and South American continents, as well as Africa, Europe, and Asia. So this moment, this one particular discovery is the match that lights the fuse. But Columbus isn't alone in his sustained contact or initiating sustained contact with another society. There are other explorers, for instance, Vasco da Gama, who eventually makes it to India around the very tip of Africa and makes direct contact between Western Europe and India. There's also other explorers who make sustained contact from, for example, Portugal to China or Portugal to Japan. And the sustained contact allows for new relationships to be built. The old way of trading along the Silk Road that I kind of used with that animated arrow that moved from east to west was millennia old. It stretched all the way back to the very early days of the classical Mediterranean societies of, like, say, the Mycenaeans and the Minoans, the societies that you read about in the Iliad and the Odyssey. They were attacking a city called Troy. Troy existed in the Middle East, in not too far away from where now Constantinople is. In fact, you can even see the western terminus of one of those in the middle of Turkey. That leads directly to Troy. So this wealth has been flowing for literally thousands of years back and forth. This trade has been happening. The term itself of Silk Roads, kind of a misnomer. It's not one road, and it wasn't just silk. It was something termed in the 19th century by a German historian who found it a little bit of an easier shorthand than to say the vast and varied trade networks that moved goods from blah, 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 blah. Moving on, right? So the Silk Road is our shorthand that we talk about the land and sea routes that moved people, ideas, money, and goods east and west. Kind of think of it as a kind of proto-globalization, an early form of globalization. The only thing is now it's being accelerated. Now, instead of these Silk Roads and these existing trade routes continuing to exist, now the customer, Western Europe, begins to directly contact the manufacturer, India, China, Japan, so on and so forth. So essentially, times they are changing, and they're changing for Europeans as well. The old route used to be going from Italy, starting in the Italian city-states, and maybe you would take your silver over to the Middle East, pick up goods, and then come back and go to Italy with those new goods and sell them off for a profit. Now, however, we have lands in the Western Hemisphere that you don't have to purchase those goods from, you can grow them in. Things like nutmeg, allspice, cinnamon, clove, those all can be grown in the Western Hemisphere. And so now you can take off from Western Europe, and instead of going through Italy, you can sail off to the Western Hemisphere and get as many of those spices, as many of those exotic woods, as many of those luxuries, as many of those goods and services that you need that you used to buy from the Eastern societies. Now you can get them west. This leads to a new kind of world order. As we move through the 1500s into the 1600s and start to get into the 1700s, we have new lands that are being exploited by Europeans, for good or for ill. Now, some European interactions with native tribes were relatively peaceful. The Dutch and French, for example, were relatively peaceful. The French intermarried and created this kind of network, this kind of extended family network that allowed the exploitation of the Northern Hemisphere, especially in Canada. The Dutch set up a trading post in a small island named Manhattan, and they named it New Amsterdam. And this was a trading post for not just Native Americans, but all other European societies to come and act as kind of like a Western Hemisphere bazaar, this kind of like one-stop shopping, if you will, the Amazon of its day. So the new land was perfect because it offered new climates that Europeans didn't have access to before. This allowed them to grow the old luxuries of like sugars and spices that were necessary for the preservation of food and also to make things taste better. They're very, very lucrative, these spices are, or these old luxuries are. And they introduced new luxuries, things like tobacco, chocolate, vanilla, avocados, pineapples. These are all new things that are coming from the Western Hemisphere and being introduced as luxuries, as new exotic foods. It broadens the diet of Europeans. As I mentioned with potatoes before, instead of having to rely upon the old grains that are very labor intensive, very sensitive to change, you can now rely upon foods that are maybe a little bit more robust, offer a little bit better form of nutrition, increases life expectancy. It increases disease resistance. It increases the ability of your children to survive into adulthood, which is an incredible change. It allows for new wealth, new contacts between societies. And so European societies, particularly Western European societies like the Dutch, the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the English, they become increasingly more wealthy than they had ever been before. So the Europeans begin to interact with these foreign societies. So they're not interacting just with the Western Hemisphere, as I mentioned. They're also interacting with Asia. Portugal is one of the first ones to visit India directly from Europe. In fact, Bartolomeo Dias, who I mentioned before, he initially comes ostensibly in a trade deputation. It's a very lucrative trade deputation, even though the trip during the trip he loses 2/3 of his ships and about half of his men. He still comes home with a 300% profit, even after all those losses are considered. So very lucrative trade. But he also engages in piracy, intimidation, and basically being a bully. The Portuguese establish a trading town at the island of Goa that remains a Portuguese possession until 1979. So that's a pretty long time. They keep that foothold in the Indian Ocean. Later, they're surpassed by the English and French, particularly in India, as England begins to offer alliance and kind of exploitation, acting as a bulwark against the Portuguese. The French also begin to accommodate, make deals with local princes, local powers, and offer themselves as a rival to the English and the Portuguese as well. China, again, Portugal is the first to arrive in China. Unlike perhaps later explorers, the Portuguese are extremely offensive in smell, in their habits, in their attitudes, and find themselves kind of kicked out of China for a good 25 years. They're replaced by traders from the Netherlands and England who are a little bit more accommodating. The Dutch and the English in particular learn from the example that the bad example that the Portuguese set and offer tribute and are relatively subservient to the Chinese in order to have direct access to those very, very lucrative markets. In fact, later on, in a few weeks, when we talk about the era of revolutions, one of the pivotal moments is the Boston Tea Party. That tea that is dumped over the side of those British ships, the British East India Company ships. That's tea that comes directly from China. It's a very lucrative uh, product that they've dumped into the ocean. And China begins to limit contact with these Westerners. It's a very new kind of experience. They don't want Westerners running all over their town. They want to control their interaction. And so they kind of limit the Europeans' contact with the Chinese. Very limited ports that they can go to. It's down to one port at one point. Very limited number of trade, very limited number of ships. This expands over time. Very limited amount of trading that they can do in any particular given year. It's a very controlled kind of environment for China. And China is able to do this because during this period, during the 15, 16, 1700s and into the 1800s, China is very powerful, very large. And it's not like England's in a position to really punch above its weight, or the Dutch are in a position to punch above their weight yet. Same thing is happening in Japan. Portugal, perhaps learning the lessons of interacting with India and China, comes to Japan with a different attitude. They come with missionaries. They come with very important trade products, particularly guns, that are unusual. The technology is nearly unheard of. The Chinese have a similar kind of weapon, though not nearly as sophisticated, not nearly as portable, and it's incredibly devastating on the battlefield. So the Portuguese learned their lessons, and Japan very much takes a cue from China and limits the Portuguese access to their people. Eventually, it becomes so limited that a law is passed that no European can stand on Japanese soil, and so an artificial island is constructed in a harbor in the city of Nagasaki, and it allows for only 13 Europeans to live on it at any one time. If you need to replace somebody, that person has to come off first before the new person can come on. Trade is conducted across a bridge. The Europeans must be escorted anytime they go across that bridge and into Japanese lands. They can't just wander around. Eventually, the Portuguese are replaced by Dutch, who are convenient rivals and are more amenable to that limited contact. And Japan becomes increasingly a closed society, afraid or maybe angered by the ideas and direct contact, the effect that the direct contact with Europeans has upon the Japanese people. We'll explore that a little bit more further on down the road in later weeks. So what does all this stuff I've been going on about, what does all this mean? Well, for Western Europe, Western European monarchies are presiding over, for the first time, an incredibly vast multi-continent empire. Take, for example, the Spanish. The Spanish have a large chunk of land on the Iberian Peninsula, but also they're in control of huge swaths of North and South America. They claim even more territory than they actually control. So how can they minister these scattered people? How do they minister these overseas trade? How do they ensure that the exploitation of these lands is beneficial for the motherlands? Western European societies begin to advance quickly as more opportunities open, as more trade opens, as more exposure to different ideas and money and products and concepts explodes in Europeans' experiences. New ideas of fundamental approaches to between humans and the world begin to emerge. The search for fundamental underlying truths, for example, will eventually lead to the scientific revolution. Searches for fundamental meanings of human existence and what does it mean to be free leads eventually to the Enlightenment, which we'll get to in another lecture. For the rest of the world, it means that there's prolonged, sustained, and large-scale contact with Europeans for the first time in human history. Trade patterns begin to be disrupted. Some empires begin to lose their edge, particularly in the Middle East. They begin to kind of recede. They fall behind monetarily, technologically, militarily. And it begins to erode eons of stable patterns. The slave trade that I mentioned before had existed before in Africa. Most of it had gone north and to the east, but now it was beginning to go further and further west on a scale unprecedented. Whereas hundreds or maybe thousands had been traded in any given year in previous eons, now that hunger for labor in the Western Hemisphere means tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands in any given year are moving westward. So what is the legacy of this prolonged contact? Well, European monarchs absolutely must consolidate their power. Prior to this 1600s period into the 1700s period, kings were limited in the amount of power that they had. There were a lot of checks upon their power. One of the pioneers of what we will call absolutism, which I'll get to in just a second, is the French monarchy, particularly Louis XIII. The French monarchy sees itself holding on to a very large amount of territory, realizes that if something is not done very quickly, they will cease to be relevant and their empire will fracture. So this leads to the emergence of absolutism. Absolutism means that the leader of the country is absolutely 100% in charge of the country. What they say is law. Their power is unquestionable. Their authority begins with them and ends with them. Who do they answer? Themselves. That's it. They are not responsive to the people at all, period. Now, absolutism varies from country to country, time period to time period. But in general, that's what this absolutism means. The king has said it, therefore it is law. It is law because the king said it. I know it's very circular in the logic, but that's the way it worked. Okay. A good example of this would be the projection of personal wealth, privilege, and power. Here is a view out the back of Versailles. Now, Versailles was a small hunting lodge until Louis XIII and later on Louis XIV really expanded it and turned it into a seat of power. He was able to move his court from Paris to Versailles, several miles, to this hunting lodge and hold court there because he was the center of political gravity for France. And it was a very conscious move. And one of the ways that he impressed upon people the amount of power he had was to literally terraform the area around his hunting lodge. In decades prior, in centuries prior, this was largely a wooded preserve, wild and overgrown, that the French kings would hunt in. Now, however, under Louis XIII, Louis XIV, and under their successors, it was increasingly cultivated. It was making nature obey the will of the king. And if nature must obey the will of the king, what can a mere human being do in the face of the king? Just look at the distance that we're talking about. I mean, that's stretching miles into the distance. He had to uproot all of this. And this is in a time before there were powered machines. This was all done by hand with using muscle power. There was no dynamite, there was no construction material, and look at that. The other thing that he used to display his power was through the use of water. And we see a massive fountain right there in the center, but we also see two beautiful pools on the left and right in the foreground. There's some more fountains further on down. If we look further and further down, you see more and more water. Water being pumped in, the control of elements. The control of water was the proof that the king was powerful. He decreed that water be brought in. He decreed that water be made into fountains. He decreed that it be made in these perfect reflecting pools, and it was. Also, the control of nature. Now, we see the leftovers of that kind of wild preserve here, but look here, these perfectly mowed grass. And yes, this is a modern photo that shows the lines of like a lawnmower, but this would not have been an unfamiliar sight to Louis XIII in the 1600s. He would have looked at that and said, oh, that's exactly what I want. So this land, this grass, for example, has to be cut by hand. Those topiaries, these hedges, hedge mazes, had to be cut by hand. Scattered throughout were incredible works of art in marble and stone and alabaster. So this view out the back of Versailles is proof that the king is absolutely powerful. And in a way, it's a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. He became powerful because he was able to project power. And he's able to project power because people allowed him to become powerful. That's the heart of absolutism. Now, absolutism does vary. In France, it was a very strong central state. They had large armies that were loyal to the king. There was an opulence that was associated with being king. There was a very loyal bureaucracy. The bureaucracy was key to keeping the king powerful. The bureaucracy was essentially the machinery through which the king's decrees were enacted, and it was faceless. It was omnipresent. The French absolutists were able to suppress dissent, religious dissent, political dissent, you name it. They were able to suppress it, and they were able to counter reforms. And at their direction, they began to embrace scientific revolution, scientific discoveries. We'll talk about that in another lecture. Russia is kind of a middle ground. Russia, somewhat absolutist, particularly under Peter the Great, and then later under Catherine the Great a century later, not related directly. Peter the Great and Catherine the Great were probably the two most dynamic monarchs of the 1700s. Uh, and they established a moderately strong central state that did have an advisory body, basically a parliament, that could control some aspects of the government. They also had large armies. They had very opulent wealth. They built palaces to imitate the French monarchs. But they did have a resistant bureaucracy. There was some weight against these decrees, particularly church control over the cultural landscape of Russia, as well as tradition, the uh, weight of the way that things were always done. Never underestimate the power of conservative traditionalist ideas to just stay in place. You can imagine as a gigantic boulder blocking your path. It takes a lot of effort to move it. And even when you do move it, it probably doesn't move very much. Okay, so there's this limited form of enlightenment that begins to emerge in Russia. Yes, there is increased amount of education. Yes, there is an increased amount of trade freedom. Yes, there is an increased amount of technological advancement, but not so much that you could have surprising rebellions or that you could have absolute social mobility. Now let's look at England. England is what I would call a failed absolutist state. There were a couple of instances in which England attempted this kind or English monarchs attempted an absolutist regime, and in both times it ended poorly for them. Either some kind of civil war or being deposed and beheaded. Never a good option in either end. So the result is in England, you have this very weak central authority, or I should say it's more that the parliament, the representative body is prime. The parliament is what really truly rules the country, and therefore power is somewhat spread out amongst multiple nobility. The relatively smaller army, large navy, relatively small army for England, not a very big army just yet. Wait until the 18th century. That changes. And of course, there's this resistant politics. The tradition in England of what would later be known as a constitutional monarchy or a monarchy that is bounded by a written document that says what the power can and cannot do stretches all the way back to the 13th century, the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215, that limits the amount of power that the king has. Now, some kings have exercised more power. Absolutely. Henry VIII absolutely exercised more power than, say, Charles I did. But in general, they didn't have the same kind of absolute authority that the French did, or even really approach the kind of like bullying presence that the Russian monarchs did. This allowed for a paradoxically a wider amount of freedom among both the middle class and the lower class, the working class. Although most of the rights were written with the intention that it would apply only to the affluent, only to the noble, eventually the middle class and the working class began to exploit those loopholes and use it to expand the tradition of freedoms in England. A good example of that would be the freedom of speech or the need to be the need to have a speedy trial and a jury by your peers. These are traditions that built up over time. So what are the takeaways about absolutism? Well, absolutism lays the groundwork for loyalty to something beyond just your family, beyond just your locale or your tribe. It lays the groundwork for what we will later cover, something called nationalism, this belief in belonging to a nation state, that the nation state, this amorphous, ill-defined thing, is now the object of your loyalty. Sometimes this conflates with loyalty to the king or loyalty to the queen, absolutely. But at the end of the day, a lot of the deposition of these monarchs is predicated upon loyalty to the nation itself, for example. It also parallels the Enlightenment, which we'll get to in another lecture. The Enlightenment is the emergence of the questions of why, or the questions of who holds power, or why do they hold power, or what is the nature of freedom, what is the nature of human society. So is absolutism an antagonist to Enlightenment? Is it a supporter of Enlightenment? Is absolutism even necessary to kind of force Enlightenment into existing? Well, we'll cover that in another lecture, but these are things to be thinking of as we move forward. It is absolutely true, however, that without absolutist monarchs, without people who were willing to try to bend the masses to their will, that you would not have had the revolutions that we did in the 1700s and into the 1800s. So here we are, we're at the recap. We're finally at the end. Now, first off, Europe was relatively weak as we come into 1500 and into 1600. They were relatively fractured, especially compared to Asia and India and the Middle East. This continues all the way into the late modern period, what we call the modern era. Number two, sustained contact with the Western Hemisphere and Asia allows Europe to begin to subvert a lot of the traditional trade and intellectual exchange paradigms. There's no longer multiple intermediaries. You can go straight to the source. Number three, there's increased wealth and opportunity, but also increased problems and exploitation that is due to this new land and these new people that are being encountered by Europeans. Now, these people who are being exploited often become slaves, they become powerless, they become subservient against their will. Also, technology begins to change. And with that technology change, a greater understanding of the world. For example, at the very beginning, when I talked about maps and cartography, in 1500, maps and cartography were very subjective. There was no real north-south kind of axis. Some maps had Jerusalem as the center of the world. Some maps had Rome as the center of the world. Some maps had Beijing as the center of the world, that sort of thing. When technology increases, when you can use mathematics to track your progress, when you can use mathematics to calculate more accurately the circumference of the world, when you can use magnetic compasses to determine where north is, then maps become increasingly more accurate. The understanding of the world becomes increasingly more granular, more detailed. So this allows Europeans to understand the world a little bit better. And then finally, number four, the larger, wealthier empires of Europe lead to the emergence of absolutist monarchs in general. Monarchs tend to have a lot of power, they tend to have a lot of prestige, they tend to rule by imperial fiat, in other words, demand, but not always. England's a great example of this. The Netherlands is another good example of how this breaks down. The Netherlands really never emerges as an absolutist monarchy, neither does England. But in general, when we're talking about Spain, Portugal, France, Russia, they are very centralized states. They become very authoritarian. They become very absolutist.